I still laugh every time the wind picks up outside my porch. Not because the sound is funny, but because every single chime hanging there reminds me how one man's obsession with control ended up destroying everything he'd spent years building. Most people think this story started with a $300 fine over a wind chime. It didn't. That fine was just the moment I finally realized our HOA president had stopped seeing neighbors as people and started seeing us as property he could manage. My name is Ethan Walker, and until all of this happened, I was probably the least interesting homeowner in Brookhaven Ridge. I wasn't the loud guy with project cars in the driveway. I wasn't the retiree who argued at every board meeting. I wasn't the family throwing weekend parties. I was just a 46-year-old CPA who worked mostly from home, drank too much black coffee, waved at everyone during evening walks, and believed that if you followed the rules, life usually stayed pretty peaceful. My wife used to joke that I trusted spreadsheets more than people, and honestly, she wasn't completely wrong. Numbers don't lie. They don't care about popularity, politics, or personalities. They simply tell the truth if you're willing to look closely enough. That's probably why what happened next unfolded the way it did. Brookhaven Ridge looked like the kind of neighborhood real estate agents love showing off. Clean sidewalks, identical mailboxes, trimmed lawns, kids riding bikes after dinner, American flags hanging from front porches. It looked perfect from the outside. But every neighborhood has that one person who quietly turns everyone's stomach whenever their SUV appears around the corner. For us, that person was Martin Caldwell. Martin had been HOA president for nearly 8 years. Officially, he was just another volunteer elected by homeowners. Unofficially, he acted like the neighborhood belonged to him. Every landscaping company somehow became his choice. Every committee somehow agreed with him. Every meeting somehow ended exactly the way he wanted. People complained in private, never in public. It's easier to let Martin have his way, my next-door neighbor Linda told me once while we were pulling weeds between our flower beds. He gets bored eventually. I smiled back then because I thought she was exaggerating. I wouldn't be smiling much longer. It happened on a Tuesday morning just after 7. I opened my front door to grab the newspaper and found a bright orange violation notice taped neatly across the center. $300. Excessive decorative noise. I actually looked around to see if maybe someone else's notice had been stuck on my door by mistake. Then I saw Martin walking down the sidewalk holding his clipboard like a sheriff making morning rounds. "Martin," I called out, holding the paper up. "This has to be some kind of mistake." He didn't even stop walking. "Morning, Ethan. $300 for my wind chime?" He finally turned around, adjusted his sunglasses, and glanced toward the small bronze chime hanging beside my porch. It had been there almost 4 years. My daughter bought it for me during a family trip to Asheville because she liked the sound it made whenever the mountain breeze came through. I probably noticed it once a week. Apparently, Martin noticed it every day. "Several complaints," he said flatly. "It's disruptive." "Who complained?" "That's confidential." "Have you ever talked to me about it?" "No." "Measure the noise. Rules are rules." I remember laughing because I honestly thought he was joking. "Come on, Martin. Seriously." He looked down at his clipboard instead of at me. "You can pay the fine or file an appeal." "You're fining me before even having a conversation?" His expression never changed. "Discussion is over." Then he turned around and kept walking toward the next house like I no longer existed. I stood there for almost a minute holding that orange paper while my coffee got cold inside. It wasn't really about the money. $300 wasn't going to ruin me. It was the arrogance, the complete certainty that he didn't owe anyone an explanation. That afternoon, Linda walked over carrying a plate of homemade cookies. "He got you too?" she asked before I even said anything. "You knew?" She sighed. "Last month, he cited the Petersons because their garden lights were supposedly too bright. Before that, he threatened Mrs. Alvarez over the color of her flower pots." "Did anyone fight him?" Linda shrugged. "People complain, then they pay." That answer bothered me far more than the fine itself. People complain, then they pay. That sentence echoed in my head all evening while I sat at my kitchen table with the HOA governing documents spread across 3 different stacks. My wife walked past around 10 carrying a blanket. "You're still reading those?" she asked. "Something doesn't make sense." She kissed the top of my head. "You have that look." "What look?" "The one you get when someone else's math doesn't add up." She went upstairs smiling. I stayed there until nearly 2 in the morning reading every bylaw, every amendment, every enforcement policy, highlighting paragraphs, writing notes in the margins. cross-checking state statutes against HOA procedures, and somewhere around page 73, I stopped feeling annoyed. I started feeling curious, because the rule Martin had cited wasn't actually there. If you want to know what happened after I realized our HOA president had just fined the wrong guy, the next morning I read the same paragraph 5 more times because I honestly thought I had missed something the night before. I hadn't. The bylaws prohibited decorative noise only if it exceeded 65 decibels, and only after an official measurement documented by the Architectural Committee. There was no blanket ban on wind chimes. There wasn't even a limit on how many someone could hang. I remember leaning back in my chair, rubbing my eyes, and laughing to myself. Martin hadn't just stretched the rules, he'd invented one. Now, most people probably would have appealed the fine and called it a day. A month earlier, that's exactly what I would have done. But something about the way he dismissed me kept replaying in my head. Rules are rules. Discussion is over. It wasn't the sentence itself. It was the confidence behind it. The confidence of someone who had never expected anyone to actually read the rules he kept quoting. That's when my accountant brain took over. My daughter Emma called that mode spreadsheet revenge. She wasn't entirely wrong. Instead of writing an appeal, I drove to the hardware store and bought a digital sound meter for $23. The cashier asked if I worked in construction. Not exactly, I smiled. I'm conducting a very small science experiment. Back home, I waited for a windy afternoon. I measured the chime from 3 different distances, then repeated the process the following morning. 37 decibels, 38, 36. Even standing directly underneath it, the reading never climbed above 40. I photographed every measurement beside that day's newspaper and saved every file with timestamps. Years of auditing had taught me one lesson: evidence always beats opinions. Then I looked back at the bylaws one more time and noticed another detail that made me grin. There was absolutely no restriction on the number of decorative wind chimes a homeowner could install. My wife looked over my shoulder while I was shopping online that evening. 28? She asked. You're buying 28 wind chimes? Technically 27, because you already own one? Exactly. She stared at me for a second before bursting into laughter. You're impossible. No, I answered quietly. I'm compliant. 3 days later, the delivery truck could barely fit everything on the porch. Different sizes, different materials, copper, aluminum, bamboo, glass, all approved decorative items according to the HOA handbook. My neighbor Frank walked across the street while I was hanging the last few. He folded his arms and shook his head. Either you've completely lost your mind, or this is going to be the funniest thing this neighborhood has ever seen. I smiled without looking down from the ladder. Let's hope it's the second one. By sunset, every porch beam, every corner post, every decorative hook held another perfectly legal wind chime. It looked ridiculous, almost artistic in a strange way. That night, a gentle breeze rolled through the neighborhood, and instead of one soft chime, there came a layered chorus. Still peaceful, still surprisingly quiet, more like distant church bells than noise. My wife sat on the porch with me drinking iced tea. You know he's going to explode tomorrow. Probably. Any regrets? I looked out across the street where Martin's house sat perfectly still. Not yet. At exactly 7008 the following morning, his black SUV stopped in front of my driveway. He climbed out carrying a thicker stack of violation notices than I'd ever seen. He didn't bother knocking. He simply began taping them across my front door one after another until the orange papers covered nearly half the glass. I opened the door before he finished. Morning, Martin. He didn't smile. Multiple violations. According to which section? Excessive decorative installations. Show me the section. He hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. The board has discretionary authority. Interesting. I held up my copy of the bylaws, because I don't see that language anywhere. His jaw tightened. You'll receive documentation. Wonderful. I'll be waiting. He stepped closer. You think you're clever? No. I looked directly into his eyes. I think I'm reading. That conversation lasted less than a minute, but somehow half the street managed to witness it from their windows. Before lunch, my phone buzzed nonstop. Linda texted first. Did he really find every single chime? Frank sent a picture from across the street with the caption, "Worth every penny." Another neighbor simply wrote, "Finally, someone pushed back." Martin probably believed the mounting fines would scare me into removing everything. Instead, each violation became another document in a growing folder on my dining room table. By the end of the month, the total reached $2,700. Every notice cited a rule that didn't exist. Every signature was Martin's. Every date matched my own photographs, proving the decorations remained well below legal noise limits. That's when I stopped thinking about wind chimes entirely. They had served their purpose. They weren't the story anymore. Martin was. More specifically, how comfortable he'd become making decisions without expecting anyone to verify them. During one quiet afternoon, I remembered another section buried deep in the governing documents. Every homeowner had the legal right to inspect the HOA's financial records by submitting a written request. As a CPA, I'd exercised similar rights on behalf of clients dozens of times. Most organizations had nothing to hide. Honest bookkeeping welcomed questions. Dishonest bookkeeping feared them. I drafted a formal request that afternoon. Professional, polite, precise. I requested vendor contracts, payment registers, board meeting minutes approving expenditures, conflict of interest disclosures, annual budgets, and bank reconciliations covering the previous 2 fiscal years. Nothing unusual, nothing unreasonable, just documents every homeowner technically owned anyway. I hand-delivered the request to the management office. The office manager, a sweet woman named Karen who always seemed exhausted, read the first page and quietly looked up at me. "You know this goes directly to Martin." I assumed it would. She lowered her voice. "He's not going to like this. He doesn't have to." She gave the smallest smile I'd seen from her in years. "No, I suppose he doesn't. State law required the HOA to respond within 30 days. Day 1 passed. Nothing. Day 5. Nothing. Day 12. Silence. Day 20. Still nothing. I almost expected them to ignore the request completely. Then, late on the afternoon of day 29, a large cardboard archive box appeared on my front porch with no note attached. Just copies. Hundreds and hundreds of pages, bank statements, invoices, checks, meeting minutes, vendor agreements, receipts. Enough paper to fill half my dining room. My wife looked at the box and sighed dramatically. "Please tell me you're taking tomorrow off." "I can't, because—" I smiled the same smile she'd seen every tax season for almost 20 years. "Because somebody made the mistake of handing an accountant their books." She laughed, kissed my forehead, and headed upstairs while I made another pot of coffee. Midnight came and went. 1 o'clock. 2. I wasn't reading quickly anymore. I was studying patterns. Vendor names repeated more often than expected. Approval signatures looked strangely identical. Meeting minutes skipped discussions that normally accompany large expenditures. None of it proved wrongdoing, but my instincts had started whispering. Around 3:15 in the morning, I reached page 4 of one vendor ledger, and for the first time all night, I completely stopped turning pages. One landscaping company had received nearly $48,000 over 18 months. No competitive bids, no approval vote recorded, no conflict disclosure, just payment after payment after payment. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. Except my experience told me companies charging 3 times market rates almost never appeared by accident. So instead of going to bed, I opened my laptop, searched the state's business registration database, typed in the company name, and the first result made every piece of the puzzle shift into place. If you think the wind chimes embarrassed Martin, wait until you see what I discovered about the company he had been quietly paying with our neighborhood's money. The company was called Evergreen Horizon Landscaping, and according to the state's business registry, it had been created just 43 days before receiving its very first payment from our HOA. That alone wasn't illegal. New companies get contracts all the time, but then I clicked on the ownership records, and there it was. The registered owner was Ryan Mercer, the same Ryan Mercer who happened to be married to Martin Caldwell's oldest daughter. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen for a long minute. Sometimes you spend hours looking for something and find nothing. Other times, the truth practically introduces itself. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. By sunrise, I'd already compared every invoice from Evergreen Horizon against 3 neighboring HOAs with communities almost identical to ours. Similar acreage, similar number of homes, similar maintenance schedules. Their annual landscaping costs averaged around $16,000. Ours had paid nearly $48,000 over 18 months for virtually the same work. That gap wasn't just a budgeting difference. It represented thousands of dollars that every homeowner had unknowingly contributed. I spent the next 2 days organizing everything into one binder, color-coded tabs, payment summaries, state business records, comparable contracts, copies of board minutes showing no competitive bidding process. Every page was labeled and cross-referenced. Using accounting had taught me something important. People argue with accusations. They struggle to argue with organized evidence. The monthly HOA meeting arrived the following Thursday, and the clubhouse was unusually full. Word had spread about the wind chimes, the fines, and the growing tension between Martin and me. Even neighbors who normally skipped meetings showed up early. Martin opened the session exactly as he always did, confident, relaxed, speaking like every decision had already been made before anyone entered the room. About halfway through, he announced the open comment period. I stood up, carrying my binder. The room became so quiet I could hear someone stirring ice in a plastic cup near the back. "Good evening," I began calmly. "I'd like clarification regarding a landscaping contract approved under this board." Martin didn't even look up. "Submit your question in writing." I already did. I opened the binder. "This company has received nearly $48,000 from homeowners over the past 18 months. I cannot find a competitive bid, a board approval vote, or a conflict of interest disclosure." Martin finally raised his head. "That's enough." I continued anyway. "According to state records, the company is owned by your son-in-law." A few people turned toward Martin. Others immediately looked at the documents I had begun passing down the first row. "Those records are being taken out of context," he snapped. "Then please explain the context," I replied. "Right now, on the record." His face changed in a way I'd never seen before. Not anger, panic. He looked toward the other board members, expecting support. Instead, they were reading the same pages everyone else had started passing around the room. One board member, an older retired teacher named Susan, quietly asked, "Martin, why weren't we told about the family relationship?" He didn't answer. Another director flipped through the payment register. "Did we ever vote on these contracts?" Silence. The room stayed perfectly still for what felt like forever. Then Frank, my neighbor from across the street, stood up. "I've lived here 11 years, he said. "If we're paying 3 times what everyone else pays, I think every homeowner deserves an answer." One voice became 3. 3 became 10. Soon, nearly the entire room was asking questions Martin had never expected to hear out loud. For years, he'd controlled every conversation simply by acting like no one else understood the paperwork. Unfortunately for him, paperwork happened to be the one language I spoke fluently. Susan requested an immediate executive vote to suspend Martin pending an independent financial review. Another board member seconded the motion before Martin could interrupt. The vote passed 4-1. Martin voted for himself. Everyone else voted against him. He slowly removed the president's nameplate from the table without saying a single word. It was probably the quietest I'd ever seen him. Within weeks, the HOA hired an outside forensic accounting firm. The findings were forwarded to state authorities for further review, along with questions regarding fiduciary responsibilities and undisclosed conflicts of interest. I won't pretend I celebrated someone's life falling apart. That's not who I am. But I also couldn't ignore the lesson hidden underneath everything that happened. Power rarely corrupts overnight. More often, it grows little by little, especially when nobody asks questions. As for my porch, all 28 wind chimes are still hanging exactly where they were. Every now and then a breeze rolls through the neighborhood, and they ring together with that same gentle sound that started this entire story. Funny enough, nobody has complained since. Maybe the chimes never were the problem. Maybe they simply revealed one that had been hiding in plain sight all along. So now I'm curious. If you discovered your own HOA had been spending your community's money behind closed doors, would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have risked becoming the neighbor everyone talked about to uncover the truth? Let me know where you stand in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'd genuinely like to hear yours.